State your call sign, old man. The voice cut clean through the humid air inside the canvas tent, sharp, controlled, and carrying just enough edge to draw every head in the room. Captain Logan Reeves stood with his arms folded, boots planted firm on the packed dirt floor, the faint crunch of gravel still clinging to his soles from outside. He was 29, squared away, and absolutely certain of the authority stitched onto his uniform. Across from him, seated on a plain metal folding chair that creaked softly under shifting weight, was Arthur Kane, 83 years old. Thin frame, worn denim jacket faded to a dull olive gray that had long ago lost any official meaning. He didn't look up right away. The low hum of portable generators outside vibrated faintly through the ground, mixing with the distant whine of rotor blades somewhere beyond the flight line. Inside the tent, conversations thinned, then died altogether, like someone had slowly turned a dial down to silence. Reeves tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Did you hear me?" he added, louder this time, for the benefit of the small cluster of Marines gathering nearby. A few of them shifted closer, drawn by the tension the way men always were. One leaned against a crate of radio equipment. Another adjusted his cover and nudged his buddy with a quiet grin. This wasn't unusual. A civilian wandering into a restricted operations tent during an active readiness exercise? That was already a problem. But the old man's calm, his complete lack of reaction, made it something else. Something off. Arthur Kane finally lifted his eyes. Pale blue. Steady. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just still. Like he was looking through the noise instead of at it. Reeves took a step forward, the canvas above them rustling softly as a warm coastal wind pushed against the tent walls. "We're running a communications drill tied directly into base command," he said, voice tightening just a fraction. "Everyone in this space identifies themselves. Rank, role, or call sign. That includes you." King didn't answer. His gaze drifted, not to Reeves, but to the radio rack behind him. A stack of field units wired into a portable command console. Green indicators flickered in steady rhythm. A headset lay coiled on top, its cords slightly frayed, the plastic worn smooth from years of use. One of the younger Marines chuckled under his breath. Maybe he forgot, he muttered, not quite quiet enough. A few more snickers followed, quick and sharp, bouncing off the canvas walls. Reeves let them. He shifted his stance, picking up a handheld radio from the table beside him, turning it over in his hand like a prop. "You see this?" he said, holding it up. "This is how we talk out here. This is how we keep people alive, keep operations clean." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "But I guess back in your day, it was, what? Yelling across a field." The laughter came easier this time. Looser. The kind that builds when someone feels safe being on the right side of authority. Kane's eyes flicked down to the radio in Reeves' hand. Just for a second. Then back to the rack. That same stillness returned, heavier now, as if it had weight behind it. Reeves noticed. Something in that glance didn't sit right, but pride moved faster than instinct. "All right," he said, voice sharpening again, stepping closer until he was just a few feet away. "Let's make this simple." He lowered the radio, his tone flattening into command. "State your call sign. Now." The tent held its breath. Even the distant rotor noise seemed to fade, swallowed by the moment. Kane's fingers moved. Slow. Deliberate. He reached out, not toward Reeves, but toward the radio rack. His hand hovered just above the worn headset, close enough to feel the faint vibration of the live signal running through it. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to. His thumb brushed lightly against the edge of the unit, a small, almost absent motion, like someone touching something familiar after a long time away. The generators hummed. A flag outside snapped once in the wind. And for the first time since Reeves had spoken, Arthur Kane drew in a quiet breath. The breath left Arthur Kane slowly, steady and measured, as if he had done it 1,000 times before in places far louder than this. His fingers remained resting lightly against the edge of the radio unit, feeling the faint pulse of signal running through it, a quiet rhythm that most men in the tent did not even notice. Captain Reeves did. Not the signal itself, but the stillness around it. The way the old man did not rush, did not react, did not bend to. The pressure that filled the space like heat. Reeves frowned slightly, the smirk fading just a fraction. "You are out of time," he said, sharper now, the authority in his voice hardening into something less controlled. "State your call sign, or I will have you escorted out." The words hung in the air, firm and final. A Marine near the entrance shifted his weight, readying himself, glancing toward Reeves for confirmation. Another reached for the flap of the tent, letting in a slice of bright sunlight and the distant shimmer of heat rising off the tarmac. Outside, somewhere beyond the line of vehicles, a helicopter engine began to spool, the low whine building slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Inside, no one moved. Kane's thumb traced along the worn plastic edge of the radio, stopping at a small nick in the casing, a shallow groove that looked accidental to anyone else. His eyes lingered there for a second longer than necessary. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not with force, just enough for the words to exist. Iron Viper. The name did not echo. It did not demand attention. It simply settled into the space, quiet and precise. For half a second, nothing happened. One of the younger Marines let out a soft, confused chuckle, as if waiting for a punchline that never came. "Iron what?" he muttered under his breath. Reeves exhaled through his nose, irritation flashing across his face. "That is not how this works," he said, stepping closer, closing the distance to barely an arm's length. "You do not just make something up and expect." A sharp burst of static cut him off. It came from the radio in his hand, sudden and loud, snapping every head toward it. Reeves froze mid-sentence, eyes dropping to the device as the speaker crackled again, this time clearer, more deliberate. A voice pushed through the interference, tight, controlled, and unmistakably alert. "Command to forward operations. Repeat last transmission." The tent went completely still. Reeves blinked once, then pressed the transmit button instinctively. "This is Captain Reeves," he replied, voice steady but edged now with something new. "We have not sent any." The radio cut him off again, the voice returning, sharper this time. "Negative, Captain. We picked up a call sign." "Say again." "Who just said Iron Viper?" The words landed differently, not like a question, like a confirmation already forming. The Marine by the radio rack straightened slowly, his earlier grin gone. Another shifted back a step, eyes flicking between Reeves and the old man without fully understanding why. Kane did not move. His hand remained resting against the unit. Fingers relaxed, as if the entire exchange had nothing to do with him. Reeves glanced up, his gaze locking onto Kane's face, searching for something, anything, that would put this back into a familiar frame. "Stand by," Reeves said into the radio, though his voice had lost a degree of its earlier certainty. He released the transmit button, the faint click sounding louder than it should have. The silence that followed was heavier now. Not empty, but waiting. The wind outside shifted, pressing against the canvas, making the tent walls ripple in slow waves. The helicopter in the distance grew louder, the steady chop of rotor blades beginning to carry through the air, low and deliberate. Inside the tent, no one laughed anymore. Reeves lowered the radio slightly, his grip tightening just enough to show it. "Who are you?" he asked, quieter now, the question slipping out before he could reshape it into an order. Kane finally looked at him fully. The same pale blue eyes. Calm. Unhurried. There was no challenge in them. No need for one. He did not answer. He did not have to. Because behind Reeves, from the radio rack itself, another unit came alive with a sudden surge of static, followed by a second voice, older, heavier, carrying a weight that did not belong to routine communication. "All stations, confirm immediately," the voice said. "Is Iron Viper on your line?" And just like that, the room understood that something had shifted, even if they did not yet know what it was. The second voice did not fade when it finished speaking. It lingered on the line like a weight pressing down across every frequency in the tent. And for the first time since the exchange had begun, Captain Reeves did not immediately respond. His hand hovered over the radio, thumb close to the transmit button, but he did not press it, because something in the tone of that voice had shifted the ground beneath him in a way he could not quite name. Around him, the Marines who had been watching with quiet amusement now stood differently, shoulders tighter, eyes sharper, the casual posture gone as if it had never existed. One of them, a lance corporal near the back, slowly removed his cover without realizing he was doing it, his gaze fixed on the radio rack where the static still whispered like a distant storm. Outside, the rotor noise grew louder, no longer background but presence, the The steady thump of blades cutting through humid air, approaching, deliberate, unmistakable. Reeves finally pressed the transmit button, but his voice, when it came, carried a new edge, not uncertainty, but caution, carefully layered over command. "Command, this is Captain Reeves," he said, choosing each word with precision. "We have an unidentified civilian in the operations tent who—" He stopped himself. The description felt wrong the moment he said it. He glanced at Arthur Kane again, searching for contradiction, for reaction, for anything that would anchor this back into a routine situation. There was none. Kane stood now, slowly, the metal chair behind him giving a soft scrape against the ground. A small sound that somehow carried farther than it should have in the silence. He did not rush, did not acknowledge the tension building around him. He simply stood as if he had always intended to. The headset on the rack swayed slightly from the earlier touch, its cord twisting gently, catching the green glow of the indicator lights. Reeves swallowed once, barely noticeable, then continued. He identified himself with the call sign Iron Viper. And this time, he did not try to soften it or reframe it. He just said it exactly as it had been spoken. The response was immediate. No static this time. No delay, just a voice cutting in with controlled urgency. "Captain, confirm location," it said. Reeves straightened instinctively, posture locking into form. "Forward operations tent, grid reference Charlie 7. He replied. A pause followed, short but dense, like a held breath stretched across miles of air and wire. Then another voice joined, deeper, older, carrying authority that did not need to raise itself. "All units in Charlie sector, maintain current positions," it said. "Do not engage, do not interfere, stand by for directive." The words were not loud, but they carried command in a way that made every Marine in the tent feel it in their chest. One of the radios on the rack flickered again, then another, as if the entire system had suddenly become aware of something it had not expected to. "Find." Reeves lowered his hand from the transmit button slowly, his grip on the radio loosening without him realizing it. He looked at Kane again, really looked this time, not at the clothes or the age or the lack of insignia, but at the posture, the stillness, the way the man stood without needing space or permission. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hale, who had been silent near the side of the tent until now, took a step forward. It was small, controlled, but deliberate enough to draw attention. His eyes were not on Reeves, but on Kane, and there was something in them that had not been there before, something like recognition struggling to surface. Hale's jaw tightened slightly. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with a steadiness that cut through the tension. "Sir," he said, the word directed at Kane, not Reeves. It hung there, subtle but undeniable. Reeves heard it. Everyone did. The shift was immediate, not visible, but felt. Like the pressure drop before a storm, Reeves turned his head sharply toward Hale, confusion flashing across his face. "Gunny," he said, but Hale did not answer him. His focus remained on Kane, studying him, measuring something beyond the surface. Outside, the helicopter sound grew stronger, closer now, the wind from its approach beginning to ripple the edges of the tent, dust lifting in faint spirals along the ground. Kane's gaze moved once more to the radio rack, then to the open flap of the tent where the light poured in, bright and unforgiving. He did not move toward it. He did not need to, because in that moment, it became clear to everyone inside that whatever had been triggered by those two quiet words was no longer contained within the tent. It was coming to them. The first gust of rotor wash hit the side of the tent like a sudden breath of wind, sharp enough to snap the loose canvas edges and send a ripple through the structure that every man inside could feel under his boots. Dust lifted from the ground outside and drifted inward in thin, swirling lines, catching the light and turning the air hazy for a moment. The sound followed a second later, heavy and rhythmic. The unmistakable pulse of a military helicopter descending low over the operations area. No one spoke. They did not need to. Every Marine in that tent knew the difference between routine air traffic and something that arrived with intent. Captain Reeves turned toward the open flap, eyes narrowing against the brightness, instinct pulling his attention outward even as the weight of what was happening behind him refused to let go. "Who authorized inbound?" he demanded. But the question had no target, no immediate answer, and it hung there unanswered as the rotor noise deepened, closer now, pressing against the ground, against the tent, against the moment itself. Gunnery Sergeant Hale did not look outside. His focus remained locked on Arthur Kane, his expression tightening not with fear, but with recognition settling into place piece by piece. "Sir," Hale said again, quieter this time, but more certain, as if the word had found its proper place. Reeves heard it more clearly now, and this time he did not ignore it. He turned back sharply, eyes moving between Hale and Kane, trying to reconcile the shift that had just happened inside his own. Chain of command. "Gunny, what are you doing?" Reeves said, his voice lower, controlled, but carrying an edge that came from losing control of something he did not understand. Hale finally glanced at him, just for a second, and in that look there was no defiance, only a calm certainty that made Reeves hesitate. "Sir," Hale repeated, this time directing it toward Reeves, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer acknowledgement, it was caution. The radios came alive again, not one, but several, their speakers crackling and overlapping. Bursts of static before settling into a coordinated stream of communication that was far too organized to be accidental. "Inbound confirmed," one voice said. "Priority channel open," said another. Then a third, sharper, cutting through the others with unmistakable authority. "Clear the immediate area. Maintain perimeter. No interruptions." The words moved through the tent like a current, and the Marines reacted without being told, stepping back, creating space without fully understanding why. They were doing it. Reeves felt it happen around him, the subtle shift in formation, the instinctive compliance to a command that had not come from him. His grip tightened again on the radio, but he did not raise it. He did not speak. Outside, the helicopter settled lower, the sound now so close it vibrated through the metal legs of the folding chair Kane had just left behind. The light at the tent entrance flickered as shadows from the spinning blades swept across the ground in rapid intervals. Dark, light, like a pulse. Kane stood exactly where he was, unmoved by the noise, by the wind, by the sudden escalation unfolding around him. His jacket shifted slightly with the air, the fabric worn thin at the edges, carrying the quiet history of years that no one in the tent had taken the time to see until now. His eyes moved once, toward the entrance, then back to the radio rack. As if both were part of the same conversation, Reeves took a step back without realizing it. The movement small but undeniable, creating distance where moments ago he had been closing it. He opened his mouth to speak, to reassert something, anything, but no words came, because at that exact moment, the radio in his hand clicked again, a single, sharp sound that cut through everything else, followed by a voice that did not ask, did not confirm, but stated with quiet finality, "Iron Viper is on." Sight. The tent fell into a deeper silence than before, not empty, but heavy with understanding just beginning to take shape. And outside, the rotor blades slowed just enough to signal that whatever had arrived was no longer approaching. It was here. For a moment, no one moved, not because they had been ordered to stand still, but because the moment itself held them there, suspended between what they thought they understood and what was now unfolding in front of them. The rotor noise outside began to ease, not fading, but lowering into a steady, controlled rhythm that signaled landing complete, and with it came a different kind of silence inside the tent, one that carried expectation. Captain Reeves felt it press against his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with rank or authority and everything to do with the realization that control had shifted away from him without permission. He turned slowly toward the entrance again, the bright daylight now cut by the shadow of the helicopter's frame just beyond the flap, its presence close enough that the air inside the tent still trembled with residual vibration. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, each one landing with the kind of certainty that did not need to announce itself. The Marines nearest the entrance straightened instinctively, shoulders pulling back, posture correcting without command, as if responding to something ingrained deeper than protocol. Gunnery Sergeant Hale stepped aside first, a subtle movement, creating a clear line from the entrance to where Arthur Kane stood, and that small action carried more meaning than any spoken order. Reeves noticed it, felt it, And for the first time since this began, he did not try to correct it. The radios remained active, but no new voices came through, as if even the network itself had paused to acknowledge what was about to happen. Kane remained still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady, not fixed on the entrance but aware of it, as though he had already measured what was coming before it arrived. The tent flap shifted, pushed inward by a controlled hand, and a figure stepped into the filtered light, the outline sharp against the brightness outside before resolving into detail. A uniform, immaculate, every line precise, every insignia placed with exactness that spoke of decades, not months. The man moved forward 2 steps and stopped, his eyes scanning the space once, quickly, efficiently, taking in the Marines, the equipment, the arrangement, and finally settling on Arthur Kane. There was no hesitation in that recognition. None. Captain Reeves felt his breath catch slightly, a reaction he could not suppress, because the posture of the man who had just entered was not one that questioned. It was one that confirmed. The distance between them was no more than 15 feet, but it felt longer, stretched by the weight of the moment. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the faint hum of the generators seemed to recede into the background. The man took one more step forward, then another, closing half the distance with the same measured pace, his boots making a soft, controlled sound against the packed ground. Reeves glanced at Hale, expecting some cue, some explanation, but Hale did not look back at him. His eyes remained forward, locked on the interaction unfolding. The air felt heavier now, denser, as if every particle carried awareness. And then, without announcement, without introduction, the man stopped directly in front of Arthur Kane. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, the kind of stillness that exists just before something irreversible. And then the man's posture shifted, precise and deliberate, his right hand rising in a clean, controlled motion to his brow. A salute, executed with absolute clarity, not rushed, not symbolic, but exact. It held for a beat, maybe 2, long enough for everyone in the tent to understand that this was not ceremony. This was recognition. Captain Reeves felt something drop inside him. Not fear, not exactly, but the collapse of an assumption he had not known he was carrying. Because in that moment, the hierarchy he had trusted had rearranged itself in a way no briefing had prepared him for. Kane did not immediately return the salute. He simply looked at the man in front of him, the same calm, the same steady presence, as if this exchange existed outside of time. And when he finally moved, it was with the same quiet precision, his hand rising slowly, returning the gesture not as acknowledgement of rank, but as something deeper, something earned long before anyone in that tent had ever worn a uniform. The silence that followed was not empty, it was complete. The salute held in the air for a fraction longer than protocol required, long enough for its meaning to settle into every corner of the tent. And when the senior officer finally lowered his hand, the motion was just as precise as when it had risen, controlled, deliberate, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any command ever spoken. He did not turn to Captain Reeves, did not acknowledge the gathered Marines. His focus remained entirely on Arthur Kane, as if the rest of the world had temporarily stepped aside. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying a depth that did not need volume to command attention. "We did not expect to see you here." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Reeves felt it immediately, the shift from uncertainty to confirmation, from confusion to something far more structured, far more real. Arthur Kane's expression did not change, not outwardly, but there was a faint movement in his eyes, something almost like recognition, or perhaps memory, surfacing without urgency. "I was nearby," Kane replied, his voice low, steady, the kind that did not seek to impress or explain, only to state. The officer gave a slight nod, as if that answer required no further detail. Behind them, the Marines remained still, their earlier energy gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that they were standing inside something they had not been trained to anticipate. The radios, once alive with overlapping chatter, had gone almost completely silent now, as if every channel had been cleared to allow this moment to exist without interference. Captain Reeves stood where he was, the radio still in his hand, but it no longer felt like a tool of authority, more like a reminder of how quickly that authority could be redefined. He glanced at Gunnery Sergeant Hale again, searching for grounding, but Hale's posture told him everything he needed to know. Shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, eyes forward, not tense, not uncertain, but aligned. Reeves turned back toward Kane and the officer, his voice carefully controlled when he spoke. Sir, I was not informed of any. He stopped himself again, the sentence collapsing before it could fully form, because even as he tried to frame it, he understood that whatever this was, it had not required his awareness to happen. The officer finally shifted his attention, just briefly, toward Reeves. And in that single glance there was no hostility, no reprimand, only a calm acknowledgement that placed Reeves exactly where he stood in the moment. Captain, he said, tone even, measured. You responded as expected. It was not praise, but it was not criticism either. It was something in between, something that left Reeves with no clear footing to push against. The officer returned his gaze to Kane, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the rotor blade slowed further, the sound dropping from a heavy thump to a softer, fading rhythm, the kind that signaled engines winding down, but even that did not fully break the stillness inside. Kane's eyes moved briefly toward the open flap of the tent, catching the last sweep of shadow from the helicopter blades, then back to the officer in front of him. You came fast, Kane said, not as a question, but as an observation. The officer allowed the smallest hint of a response, not quite a smile, but something close. We always do, he replied. The exchange was quiet, almost understated, but it carried a familiarity that none of the others in the tent could place. A shared understanding built long before this moment, long before this base, long before anyone here had been given rank or responsibility. Captain Reeves felt it then, fully, the realization settling into place not through explanation, but through presence. This was not about protocol, not about identification, not about clearance. This was something else entirely, something that operated on a different level of recognition. His grip on the radio finally loosened, his hand lowering slightly to his side without conscious thought. The weight in his chest shifted, not disappearing, but changing form, becoming something closer to respect, though he had not yet decided to call it that. Gunnery Sergeant Hale took a slow breath, barely visible, as if releasing tension he had been holding since the moment the call sign had been spoken. No one else moved. No one else spoke, because the moment did not belong to them. It belonged to the two men standing at its center, one in a uniform that carried visible authority, the other in a worn jacket that carried something far older, far deeper, something that did not need to be displayed to be understood, and in that silence, the entire tent adjusted itself around that truth. The air inside the tent did not return to normal after that exchange. It settled into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried weight that had not been there before. The senior officer shifted his stance slightly, not breaking eye contact with Arthur Kane, but acknowledging the space around them with a subtle awareness that re-established structure without disrupting the moment. We have maintained the channel, he said, his voice low, controlled. For years, just in case. The words were not directed at the room, only at Kane, but they echoed outward all the same. Kane gave the faintest nod, not in surprise, but in recognition of something expected. You kept it alive, he replied. It was not a question, and it did not need confirmation. The officer's expression did not change, but there was a quiet firmness in his posture that answered it anyway. Behind them, Captain Reeves felt the meaning of that exchange without fully understanding its history, like hearing a conversation in a language he almost recognized but could not translate. His mind searched for context, for documentation, for something he could anchor this to, but nothing came, because whatever this was, it did not exist in briefings or operational manuals. It existed somewhere else. Gunnery Sergeant Hale shifted his weight slightly, the movement controlled, respectful, as if aligning himself more precisely with the reality that had just revealed itself. His eyes moved from Kane to the officer and back again, confirming what instinct had already told him. One of the younger Marines near the radio rack glanced down at the equipment, then back up, as if expecting it to behave differently now, as if the machines themselves understood more than he did. Outside, the helicopter engines continued to wind down, the rotor blades slowing until their shadow no longer flickered across the tent entrance, leaving the lights steady and clear. A vehicle door closed. Somewhere beyond the tent, the sound crisp and final, followed by distant footsteps that did not approach, but held position, forming a perimeter without needing to be seen. Inside, the radios remained quiet, no longer searching, no longer questioning, simply open, ready. Captain Reeves finally lowered his radio completely, letting it rest against his side, his fingers relaxing their grip as the tension that had held them eased into something else. He took a measured breath, then another, grounding himself in the only structure he knew how to rely on, even as that structure had shifted. "Sir," he said carefully, addressing the senior officer this time. "Request clarification on status." The phrasing was deliberate, formal, an attempt to regain footing through protocol. The officer turned his head slightly toward Reeves, just enough to acknowledge him, and for the first time, there was a trace of something in his expression that could almost be read as understanding. "Status is confirmed," he said. The answer was precise, complete, and offered nothing more. Reeves absorbed it, the simplicity of it, the finality of it, and for a moment, he considered pressing further, asking for designation, for chain of command confirmation, for anything that would restore the framework he was trained to operate within, but he did not, because even as the questions formed, he knew they would not apply here. Arthur Kane shifted his weight slightly, a small adjustment, the kind a man makes after standing for a while, but it drew attention nonetheless. His gaze moved once more across the tent, taking in the Marines, the equipment, the space itself, not critically, not judgmentally, but with quiet awareness. "You built this well," he said, the words directed toward no one in particular and yet heard by everyone. There was no praise in the tone, only observation. But it landed with more weight than any commendation. Gunnery Sergeant Hale straightened just a fraction more at that, as if the words had found their mark. The officer gave a slight nod again, acknowledging the statement, then looked back at Kane. "We learned from what came before," he replied. The exchange was simple, almost understated, but it carried layers none of the others could fully see. Captain Reeves felt it again, that shift, that quiet redefinition of where authority truly rested in the room. It was not in the rank he wore, not in the radio he held, not even in the command structure he trusted. It was in something older, something carried by the man standing in a worn jacket with no visible insignia. Reeves straightened slowly, not out of reflex, but out of recognition, his posture aligning without being told. The tent remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said, and in that silence, every man present understood, in his own way, that the moment they were standing in would not be explained later, would not be written down, would not be fully understood, but it would be remembered. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into something that no longer felt temporary but established, as if the tent itself had adjusted to a different set of rules that no one had written down. Captain Reeves stood straighter now, not out of habit, but out of understanding, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet awareness that demanded precision without ego. He shifted his weight once, subtle, controlled, and brought his feet together just enough to reflect the posture forming. Across the Marines around him, no one had given the order, but it spread anyway, one man at a time, like a ripple that did not need to be seen to be followed. Gunnery Sergeant Hale was already there, fully aligned, eyes forward, shoulders squared, the embodiment of a discipline that had found its proper place again. Arthur Kane remained at the center of it all, unchanged, his presence neither commanding nor yielding, simply existing in a way that made everything else arrange itself around him. The senior officer took a small step to the side, opening the space just enough to acknowledge Kane without obstructing him, a gesture so precise it felt rehearsed, though it clearly was not. Outside, the helicopter had gone quiet now, its blades slowing to a near stop, the last faint clicks of cooling metal carrying through the open flap of the tent. The light beyond remained steady, no longer flickering, revealing a stillness on the tarmac that mirrored what had taken hold inside. Kane's gaze moved once more, briefly, toward the entrance, then across the Marines, not inspecting, not judging, simply seeing. And in that brief sweep, each man felt it. Not pressure, not expectation, but recognition, the kind that did not need words to define it. Captain Reeves felt it more sharply than the others, because he understood what had shifted inside him. The instinct to question, to assert, to control, had been replaced by something quieter, something steadier. Respect, not given out of rank, but drawn out by presence. He inhaled slowly, then spoke, his voice measured, clear, and free of the edge it had carried before. "Sir," he said, this time directing the word toward Arthur Kane, and the difference in tone was unmistakable. It was not formality. It was acknowledgement. Kane turned his head slightly toward him, the same calm expression, the same steady eyes. Reeves held the moment, not rushing it, not filling it with unnecessary words. Permission to stand by. He continued, choosing the phrase carefully, offering position rather than control. Kane studied him for a brief second, not long, but long enough to see the shift that had taken place. Then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but definitive. "Stand by," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried through the tent with absolute clarity. Reeves did not respond verbally. He did not need to. His posture adjusted instead, locking into place, not as a reaction, but as a decision. Around him, the Marines mirrored it fully now, their earlier uncertainty gone, replaced by a unified stillness that required no instruction. The senior officer watched this unfold with a measured gaze, not surprised, not impressed, simply observing something that made sense. "It holds," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Gunnery Sergeant Hale heard it and understood. The standard had not been lost. It had only been waiting. Kane shifted his weight slightly, the movement small, natural, but it drew attention nonetheless. His hand brushed briefly against the side of his jacket, fingers grazing the worn fabric as if confirming something that had never truly left. He looked once more toward the open light of the tent, then back to the officer. "You kept them ready," he said. The officer gave a slight nod. "We tried," he replied. The exchange was simple, but it settled into the space like something complete. Captain Reeves felt it in that moment, fully, the final piece of understanding falling into place. This was not about proving anything, not about revealing power, not about correcting a mistake. It was about recognition, quiet and absolute, the kind that did not raise its voice, did not demand attention, but reshaped everything around it. And as the last of the rotor noise faded into the distance, leaving only the low hum of the bass and the steady rhythm of breath inside the tent, every man present stood exactly where he needed to be, not because he had been told, but because he now understood why. For a long moment, nothing changed, and yet everything had already shifted into its final place. The tent no longer felt like a temporary command post filled with movement and noise. It felt anchored, grounded by something that could not be seen but was unmistakably present. Captain Reeves remained at attention, not rigid, not forced, but aligned in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. The radio at his side was silent now, its earlier urgency gone, replaced by a quiet readiness that no longer demanded control. Across from him, Arthur Kane stood with the same calm that had defined every moment since he arrived, unchanged by the recognition, untouched by the reaction it had created. The senior officer took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, a deliberate gesture that shifted the center of the moment fully onto Kane without announcement. Outside, the last faint ticking of the helicopter's cooling engine faded into the broader hum of the base, the distant sounds of activity returning in fragments, vehicles moving, voices carrying across open ground, but none of it entered the tent with any weight. Inside, the stillness held. Gunnery Sergeant Hale drew in a slow breath, then another, his posture steady, his expression composed, but there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something like quiet confirmation that the stories he had heard, the fragments passed down in half-finished sentences and careful tones, had not been exaggerated. They had simply been incomplete. One of the younger Marines, near the radio rack, shifted slightly, his boots making the faintest sound against the ground, then stilled again, as if even that movement felt too loud in the presence of what had just been revealed. Captain Reeves felt the weight of his earlier words settle fully now, not as embarrassment, not as regret, but as understanding. He had not been wrong to question, not been wrong to enforce, but he had been unaware, and that difference mattered more than anything else. His gaze moved once more to Cain, not searching this time, not measuring, simply acknowledging. Cain met that look briefly, then let his eyes drift past him, taking in the tent one last time, the equipment, the Marines, the structure they had built and maintained. There was no judgment in it, only a quiet recognition of effort, of continuity. "You will be fine," Cain said, the words spoken without emphasis, without ceremony, but they carried through the tent with a clarity that settled into every man who heard them. The senior officer inclined his head slightly at that, accepting it not as reassurance, but as fact. Captain Reeves felt something steady inside him at those words, something that did not need to be explained, only held. Cain shifted his weight, a small movement, then turned slightly toward the open flap of the tent, the light outside steady and clear. No one moved to stop him. No one spoke. There was no need. The path was already open. He took a step forward, then another, his boots making a soft, even sound against the ground. Each step measured, unhurried. As he passed, the Marines nearest him did not turn their heads sharply or follow him with obvious attention, but their posture held, their alignment precise, their stillness intentional. It was not performance, it was respect, quiet and complete. Captain Reeves remained where he was, his eyes forward now, not tracking Cain's movement, because he understood that this moment was not meant to be followed, only witnessed. The senior officer turned slightly as Cain reached the edge of the tent, just enough to watch him step into the light, then returned to stillness. Outside, the brightness took him in, the outline of his figure briefly defined against the open space before blending into the broader movement of the base. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly, absorbed into the distance without ceremony. Inside the tent, no one spoke. No one broke formation. The silence that remained was not empty. It was full, carrying the weight of what had just passed through it. Captain Reeves stood there, steady, composed, and for the first time since the moment began, completely certain of something that did not come from rank or instruction. Some names were not meant to be questioned, not meant to be proven, only recognized when they appeared and remembered long after they were gone.